When I first moved into the apartment building, everything felt strangely perfect. It was quiet, tucked away in a sleepy neighborhood with old trees that lined the streets like gentle guardians. The kind of place where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen, which, to be honest, was exactly what I was looking for. I was tired of chaos, of the constant movement and noise of the city. I just wanted peace. My unit was small but comfortable, and the rent was surprisingly reasonable for the area. That alone should have been my first red flag. The day I moved in, I noticed a man watching from the apartment next door. He stood at his window, arms crossed, almost completely still. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stared, like he was assessing me, trying to memorize every detail of my face. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just curious. I'd be curious too if someone new moved in next door after the unit sat empty for months. Later that evening, as I was carrying in the last of my boxes, he suddenly appeared in the hallway. He startled me, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because he was completely silent. 1 second the hallway was empty, and the next, he was standing right there with that same vacant stare. He introduced himself as Mr. Jenkins. His voice was soft, almost rehearsed, and he offered a small nod instead of a handshake. Something about him felt off, not dangerous, just unnerving, like he was pretending to be normal. Over the next few days, I started to notice how quiet he was. I never heard a TV, no music, no phone conversations, not even the sound of footsteps. It was like he barely existed. I'd pass by his door every morning, and there would never be any sign of life. No packages outside, no smells of cooking, no movement through the peephole. But whenever I left or came home, he seemed to know. I'd hear his door creak open just a few inches, or catch a glimpse of him through the blinds, always watching, always observing. It was subtle at first, easy to ignore, but the longer I stayed there, the more I felt like I was being monitored. Not in an obvious way, but in a slow, creeping manner that made me question whether I was just being paranoid. One night, I came home late from work. It was around 11:30 p.m. and the hallway lights were dim. As I unlocked my door, I heard a soft click behind me. I turned, and there he was again, standing at his door, half hidden in shadow, watching me. He didn't say anything, just stood there with that same expressionless face. I gave a nervous smile, muttered goodnight, and quickly went inside. From that moment on, I started locking my door the second I walked in. Something about the way he appeared out of nowhere left me deeply unsettled. Over time, I noticed he never left the building, not once. I worked different shifts, came and went at all hours, but I never saw him step outside. No one ever visited him. No deliveries. No friends. He was just always there, existing in that strange, quiet apartment with drawn curtains and a locked door. I once asked the building manager about him, trying to keep it casual. She hesitated before answering, said he'd been living there for over 10 years and never caused any problems, but admitted she didn't know much else. Keeps to himself, she said. Real quiet type. That was the thing. He was too quiet. Almost unnaturally so, and, in that silence, something began to grow. A slow, unsettling feeling in my chest that something wasn't right with the man living next door. It started subtly at first, the kind of thing you might chalk up to an old building with thin walls. I'd be lying in bed, scrolling on my phone or reading a book, and I'd hear faint footsteps. Nothing alarming, just the soft, rhythmic creaking of floorboards coming from the apartment next door. At first, I assumed it was normal. After all, everyone paces sometimes, especially in small spaces where you can't help but move around to stretch your legs. But as the days passed, those footsteps began to take on a different pattern. One, that didn't feel quite right. They always came late at night, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning. Not the kind of restless shuffling you'd expect from insomnia, but slow, deliberate pacing, back and forth, from one end of his apartment to the other. over and over again like he was wearing a track into the floor. The same number of steps, the same rhythm, every single night. It was eerie, too exact, too controlled. Sometimes it would stop abruptly, and I'd hold my breath, wondering if it was finally over. But then it would start again. The same dragging, sound of footsteps on worn wooden boards, like a metronome marking time. The strangest part was that the rest of the building was silent, dead silent. No other tenants seemed to be awake. No late-night television, no muffled conversations, no sound of water running through the pipes. Just those footsteps from the apartment next door, echoing through the wall, as if they were the only thing alive in the entire building. I started, sleeping with a fan on, just to drown it out. But even then, there were nights when I could still hear it underneath the hum. It became impossible to ignore. Then the voices started. It was one night when I was lying on my couch, trying to fall asleep after a long shift. The footsteps had started, like usual, but then I heard something else. A soft, mumbling voice. At first, I thought he was on the phone. I turned off the fan and listened carefully. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and I couldn't make out the words. But what made my skin crawl was that, after a pause, I heard another voice. It was faint, much quieter than his, and it didn't sound like it belonged to an adult. It was childlike, shaky, almost pleading. I sat up, confused and alarmed. I knew for a fact that Mr. Jenkins lived alone. No one ever visited him. The building manager even confirmed it. So, who was he talking to? And why did that second voice sound so scared? I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to catch more of the conversation, but it had stopped. All I could hear then was a single thud, like something heavy had been dropped or knocked over, followed by complete silence. I sat there for hours, staring at the wall, waiting for another sound, but none came. After that night, the footsteps became more erratic. Sometimes they would start and stop abruptly, like someone was pacing furiously then suddenly freezing. Other times I'd hear what sounded like furniture being moved, loud scraping noises that didn't match the quiet personality of the man I thought I knew. I began to dread the nights, knowing I would be kept awake by the sounds of someone who never seemed to sleep, someone who never left their apartment, someone whose nightly routine was beginning to feel less like insomnia and more like obsession. The worst nights were the ones when I heard knocking, not on my door but within the walls themselves, soft, rhythmic knocks, like something or someone was trying to get out or maybe trying to get my attention. They always came from the same spot, just behind the headboard of my bed. I started sleeping on the couch to avoid it, but the knocking followed. It seemed to know where I was. It began with a faint, almost sour scent, lingering in the hallway just outside my apartment door. I didn't think much of it at first. Old buildings often carry strange odors. Dust, rusted pipes, mold hidden behind walls. But this smell was different. It wasn't constant. It would come and go, sometimes barely noticeable, and other times so strong it made me gag. It smelled like decay, not the musty smell of wet wood or mildew, but something organic, something rotting. At first, I assumed maybe a neighbor had forgotten to take their trash out, or perhaps someone spilled something in the hallway and didn't clean it properly. But as the days went by, the smell grew worse. It would drift through the vents late at night, subtle but unmistakable. It clung to the air like a warning, sour and heavy, invading my apartment and settling into the fabric of my furniture, into my clothes, even into my skin. I tried spraying air fresheners, burning, candles, leaving the windows open, but nothing mastered for long. The scent always returned, thick and foul, like something was decomposing close by. What made it even more unsettling was that it seemed to come almost entirely from Mr. Jenkins's apartment. The moment I stepped into the hallway near his door, the smell intensified. It was like hitting an invisible wall of rot. I started holding my breath whenever I passed by, feeling sick to my stomach every time I got near. I wasn't the only one who noticed. One of the other tenants, an older woman from down the hall, mentioned it one day while we were waiting for the elevator. She said something was off about the building lately. I could tell she wanted to say more, but stopped herself. Her eyes flickered toward Mr. Jenkins' door, and then she looked away. I called the building manager about it, told her there was an awful smell coming from the hallway near my unit, and that it seemed strongest around apartment 2B. She said she'd look into it. 2 days later, she told me she knocked on his door, but got no answer. Claimed she didn't have the authority to enter without permission unless there was an emergency. When I pressed her, she shrugged it off, saying he probably just forgot some food in the fridge or something, but the smell wasn't just food. It was something deeper, more disturbing. I started to become obsessed with it. Every time the odor returned, I found myself pacing, trying to trace where it was strongest. I'd stand near my air vents, trying to see if I could smell it there, or near the wall I shared with Mr. Jenkins' apartment. Sometimes, if I pressed my ear to the wall, I could hear the faint hum of something, maybe a fan, maybe a dehumidifier, but not the usual noises you'd expect from someone living next door. It felt like something was hidden in there, something he didn't want anyone to find. Then one night, the smell became unbearable. It was so thick and potent it actually woke me up. I stumbled out of bed, coughing, trying to cover my nose. My entire apartment reeked. I checked my kitchen, my trash, my sink, everything, but nothing inside my place was the source. I walked into the hallway, and the moment I opened my door, I nearly vomited. The smell outside was overwhelming, a wave of putrid air that felt like it had a presence of its own. It curled around me like invisible smoke, suffocating and relentless. I knocked on Mr. Jenkins's door that night, just once. A soft knock, half hoping he wouldn't answer. There was no sound from the other side, no movement, just silence and that unbearable stench that made my eyes water. I stood there for a few moments, my knuckles still against the wood, listening, waiting, hoping for anything that might explain the awful smell that seemed to be growing stronger by the day. It was around mid-October when the objects started appearing. The first one showed up on a rainy evening, right outside my door. A small, folded piece of paper, slightly damp from the drizzle, placed neatly on the welcome mat. At first glance, it looked like junk mail, maybe a flyer or a local ad. But when I picked it up and opened it, there was no text, just a crude drawing. It looked like a face, but not a normal one. The proportions were distorted, the mouth wide and crooked, the eyes just hollow black circles. I stared at it for a long time, unsure what to make of it. It gave me a strange, uneasy feeling, the kind that crawls into your stomach and refuses to leave. I threw it away, thinking it was some kid's idea of a prank. But the next morning, another object appeared. This time, it was a key, old, rusted, with no label or tag. It was placed carefully in the exact same spot where the drawing had been. I picked it up, examining the cold metal in my hand. It looked like a key to something ancient, maybe a locker or a chest. But I didn't recognize it. It definitely didn't belong to my apartment, and I had no idea where it came from. I left it on my kitchen counter, not sure what else to do. Following day, it was a button. A large black coat button, like the kind you'd find on an old winter coat. It was scratched and worn, and oddly warm to the touch, as if it had been in someone's pocket moments before. That's when I started to worry. These items weren't random. They felt chosen, deliberate, and more unsettling, they were being placed there when I wasn't looking. I made a point to check my doorstep before going to bed, but somehow, by morning, a new object would appear. Always small, always seemingly meaningless, yet always oddly personal, like someone was trying to tell me something in a language I didn't understand. One night, I stayed up late, sitting silently in the dark living room, staring at the front door through the peephole, determined to catch whoever was leaving these things. The building was quiet, everyone else asleep. Hours passed, the clock ticking loudly on the wall. Around 3:15 a.m., I heard something, a soft rustling, like fabric, brushing against the floor, then the faintest creak of a floorboard just outside my door. I held my breath, not daring to move. The sound stopped for a moment, then came a soft tap, barely audible. I leaned forward, slowly and carefully, and peered through the peephole. There was no one there, but when I finally opened the door, heart pounding, another object had appeared, a single black feather, slightly damp, lying exactly where all the others had been. I looked up and down the hallway. It was completely empty. No sound, no footsteps, no doors closing in the distance. Just silence, thick and heavy, like the building was holding its breath. I started documenting the items, taking pictures, and writing down the time I found them. A matchbook from a diner I'd never heard of. A broken watch with the hands stuck at 4:17. A child's crayon, dull and snapped in half. Each one felt more specific, more targeted. It was as if someone had access to my memories, to the forgotten corners of my life, and was leaving breadcrumbs made of nightmares on my doorstep. Eventually, I installed a small security camera aimed at my door, hoping to finally get answers. I reviewed the footage every morning, but the recordings always cut out between 3 and 3:30 a.m. No glitches before or after, just that one window of time, completely blacked out. And every morning, something new would be there. I started noticing that the lights in Mr. Jenkins' apartment behaved strangely. At first it was subtle, just a flicker now and then, like an old bulb nearing the end of its life. But then it became more frequent, more erratic. The hallway would be dark. And suddenly, a sharp flash of light would burst through the tiny gap under his door, like a strobe going off in a locked room. Sometimes the light would stay on for hours, glowing through the thin curtains behind his windows, even at 3 or 4 in the morning. Other nights, it would blink in patterns, like Morse code, as if someone inside was trying to send a silent, urgent message through pulses of light. It became impossible not to notice. I'd be brushing my teeth, and through the mirror in the bathroom, I'd catch the reflection of those flashing lights from his windows across the courtyard. Or I'd be walking back from the mailbox at night and see the odd glow pulsing behind his curtains. They weren't warm lights either, no soft amber from a lamp or the cool blue of a television screen. They were stark white, almost surgical, like something you'd see in a hospital operating room or an interrogation chamber. It made his apartment look like a place where people were studied, not lived in. One night I couldn't sleep. The blinking was so consistent, it started to feel deliberate. I stood near my front door, watching through the peephole again. Around 2:47 a.m., his light began flickering in rapid succession. Short bursts, long pauses, then short again. I felt my heart beating in sync with it, as if it were trying to control my rhythm, pulling me into its pattern. It wasn't just a faulty light. It was rhythmic, calculated, unnatural. I even recorded it on my phone and later tried to compare it to Morse code, thinking maybe it spelled something. I couldn't decipher anything, but that only made me more disturbed. What if it wasn't meant for me to understand? Then the humming started. A low, constant buzz that would seep through the walls and into my bones. It was faint at first, like the dull vibration of an old refrigerator, but soon it became louder, more intense, like a generator revving up inside his living room. It never had a source I could find. I pressed my ear to the wall, and the hum felt alive, like something dormant was waking up. It would rise and fall, pulsing with the lights, perfectly in sync. It wasn't a sound that made sense for a normal apartment. No machine in any home should make that kind of sound. I reported it again. This time, I practically begged the building manager to check on him, told her it was a safety concern, that the electricity might be faulty, or that something illegal could be happening. She promised to call him, and even left a note under his door. But nothing changed. If anything, it got worse. One night, the lights didn't blink. They stayed on, all night, bright and blinding. Even with my curtains drawn, I could see the glow bleeding into my apartment. I wrapped a towel under my door, trying to block the light, but it still seeped through like smoke. That same night, I swear I saw a figure move past his window. A quick shadow there and gone in an instant, but unmistakably human. And yet, I knew no one ever came or went from his place. I never saw deliveries, never saw him take out the trash, never heard a second voice. And yet, that night, the silhouette had looked like someone standing perfectly still, just behind the curtain, watching the street, watching me. After that, I avoided looking at his window altogether. I kept my blinds closed, even during the day. I didn't want to know when the light would flicker again or when the humming would start up. But sometimes, even with everything blocked out, I could still feel the pulsing glow on my skin, as if it had burned its way through the walls. I remember the night I finally decided to follow him. Not out of curiosity, but because fear had grown so thick inside me that it was suffocating. I hadn't seen Mr. Jenkins in daylight for weeks, maybe longer. His presence was like a shadow in the building, something everyone sensed but rarely spoke of. But that evening, just past midnight, I heard his door creak open. It was the first time in a long while that I'd heard any noise come from his apartment, and the sound of that slow, dragging door made every hair on my body stand upright. Turned off the lights in my apartment and crouched near the window, peeking through a thin slit between the curtains. There he was, a tall, thin figure wrapped in a long coat that reached below his knees. His walk was strange, uneven, as if one leg dragged slightly behind. He didn't close the door behind him, just left it ajar, swinging slightly as he limped toward the stairwell. I held my breath, barely believing what I was seeing. There was something unnerving about the way he moved. Mechanical, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Like someone trying to imitate a human being and not quite getting it right. After a moment of hesitation, I stepped outside and quietly followed him down the stairs, staying several steps behind. He didn't seem to notice me. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care. The hallway was dead silent, except for the faint squeak of the floorboards under his feet. When we reached the front entrance of the building, he stopped. He stood perfectly, still for what felt like several minutes, staring at the door as if he was waiting for something or someone. I pressed myself into the shadows, heart pounding so loudly I was afraid he might hear it. Eventually, he opened the door and stepped outside into the cold night air. I followed at a distance, careful not to make a sound. He didn't head toward the street or any of the nearby shops. Instead, he veered off to the left, into the narrow alley that ran behind our building. I knew that alley well, lined with dumpsters, broken concrete, and the overwhelming smell of rot and dampness. But tonight, it felt different. The air felt heavier, colder, and the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. He stopped again near the far end of the alley, beside an old rusted door that led into the basement of the abandoned building next door. I had always assumed that place was sealed off, but he pulled out a key and unlocked it with ease. The door creaked open slowly, and a faint light spilled out, an eerie green glow that barely illuminated the cracked bricks around it. Without a glance backward, he stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. I waited, torn between fear and the unbearable need to know what was going on. Finally, I crept closer, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I noticed it hadn't latched completely. A small sliver remained open. I pressed my eye against the gap and peered in. What I saw didn't make sense. The basement wasn't empty or abandoned like I'd expected. It had been transformed into something else entirely. Strange symbols were drawn on the concrete floor, lit candles flickering in a perfect circle. A low hum vibrated through the walls, and the same harsh white light I had seen in his apartment pulsed from fixtures that didn't belong in any ordinary room. And there he was, standing in the center of it all, facing a wall covered in photographs. Dozens of them, some blurry, some clear, and many of them were of people in our building. My own face stared back at me from at least 3 of them. In one, I was at my mailbox. In another, I was sleeping on my couch, the window behind me slightly open. The final one was from that very night, taken just minutes before I had followed him out the door.